Hello, welcome to CIBER Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Christopher Rice, and our guest today is Dr. Sarah Bauerle Danzman. Dr. Bauerle Danzman is an assistant professor at Indiana University's School of Global and International Studies. Trained as a quantitative political economist, Dr. Bauerle Danzman researches how investment promotion agencies can most effectively catalyze foreign investment for localized, sustainable, and shared development. She is the author of the upcoming book, Local Firms, Financial Constraints, and Foreign Capital: How Domestic Business Influences Policies Toward Foreign Investment. In this edition, Dr. Bauerle Danzman will share her insights on current events in international trade, also drawing on her work with and research on international institutions to discuss the role of business in investment liberalization. Sarah, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
Absolutely. Well, to start out, what do you consider to be the most important trends currently in the global political economy? What development strategies are showing to be most effective, and what does public opinion look like toward foreign direct investment here in the U.S. and abroad?
Well, Chris, it probably comes to no surprise that some of the biggest and most important developments in the global political economy these days are occurring within the Western world, so Europe and the U.S. We have Brexit. We have in the U.S. a turning inward and a focus less on building international institutions and instead more of a rhetoric about the downside of trade and globalization. And so as that is occurring, we also are seeing the rise of Brazil, India, Russia, and most importantly, China, who are coming to the global stage and wanting to have more of a say in the way the international system works. And what we're seeing today is a shift. Perhaps, we're not exactly sure where this will take us because we're in the midst of it right now, but we're seeing a shift towards these other developing countries. And so when you ask what sort of development strategies are working right now, part of what has created this move towards the developing countries and this drawing back in the industrialized Western world is really a reaction to the rise of China and the rise of more state-led development. And so what we are probably going to be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years is a return to more state-led capitalism, meaning the governments of these countries are going to be driving some of the most important economic forces and commercial forces to come. In terms of how people view investment, in general, people in most countries like foreign investment because that investment brings jobs. However, they tend to like it a bit more in the abstract. So if you poll people in both developed and developing countries, you'll see that most people have very high positive feelings towards investment generally. But when we start to delve into specific companies, they tend not to like very big multinational firms. And the reason why is because they view these firms as being exploitative in some way. Even though multinational firms tend to pay more than domestic firms, and in some ways can have the resources to be better global corporate citizens, we see individuals reacting very negatively to these very large companies. And that makes sense given the fact that with the most current data that we have, of the top 100 governments and other entities in terms of revenue, 69 of them are companies rather than governments.
Interesting. Well, Sarah, you have a new book coming out in which you examine the effects of credit conditions on firms' policy preferences and regulatory influence. What is it about Malaysia and Indonesia that made them ideal for your research? And can you tell us more about your findings and the implications for policymakers?
Sure. So in my book, I spend quite a bit of time looking globally at trends in investment and what is driving them. And one of the main points of my book is that investment policies become more liberalized or more open when the domestic business elites decide to embrace foreign investment in multinational firms. And I view this, and I explain in the book why a lot of these changes in the business community's view of foreign firms, which oftentimes are viewed as competitors rather than as complementary to them, is dependent on the credit environment. And so I use Malaysia and Indonesia as comparative case studies in my book because they work really well to help me trace the processes through which investment promotion and investment policies change over time in countries. Malaysia and Indonesia both experienced a very large financial shock at the same time in 1997 during the Asian financial crisis, but they reacted to it in very different ways. In particular, Indonesia went to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and by getting a loan from the IMF, had to submit to many conditions that changed their economy. And they also democratized during that time, whereas Malaysia decided to go it alone and didn't need to change their economy because of an international institution, and instead kind of stayed the course in interesting ways. And so what I actually find is that because Malaysia didn't get this large injection of cash from the IMF, they actually had to, over time, fundamentally change their banking sector. And because of that, and because of credit constraints that the local business environment community experienced, Malaysia opened up far more to investment post-1997 than did Indonesia. And that is exactly the opposite of what many previously have kind of focused on in terms of what brings about investment policy change. And so that's why I focus on those two countries in my book.
Okay. What can a policymaker take away from your study?
So I think that there are two things that policymakers can get out of this book. The first is that the local business environment and what the business community wants and will lobby for from governments really depends on the credit environment. And so if policymakers want to liberalize and want to be able to work with the business community as partners for change and development, they need to look more closely at how the local banking sector is structured. Because if the local banking sector provides lots of subsidies to highly connected firms, those firms are in a great position and are going to resist more opening and liberalizing policy changes. But if instead those firms have to compete in global capital markets for their investment, they're going to react much differently because they're not in a privileged position in the credit market.
Okay, thank you. When people think of international political actors, they usually consider just state governments and multilateral institutions. What role do businesses have in shaping international policy, and what changes are we seeing in the definition of a global political actor?
That's a really great question, Chris. Oftentimes people think only of governments and maybe international institutions as being important for structuring the global political system. But for centuries, multinational enterprises have been crucial to the developments of globalization. For instance, far back during colonization, we know that we had the first multinational firms, basically, which were the Dutch and British East Indies companies. And those commercial interests shaped what colonization looked like for centuries, and we're still experiencing kind of the aftermath of that colonization process today. More currently, global firms orchestrate about 80% of all trade globally. So about a third of all trade is driven by basically a firm operating in multiple countries trading within its global corporate structure itself. It's called intra-firm trade. But global firms, when we also include all of the business-to-business trade that occurs cross-nationally through complex global supply chains, are driving the vast majority of international trade. And so what that means is that when we see these backlashes to trade and globalization and the politics that are entwined in that, this is all stemming from the way that the global economic system is currently structured, and that structurization process occurs through choices that global firms make. In terms of what we see global firms doing, in terms of actually being involved in policymaking processes, we have an international system that was designed when multinational firms were not as central. And so these firms don't always have a very large formal role in the process of creating policies. But they do have a very important informal role. And in particular, we can see through the UN that almost 10,000 global firms have signed on to what's called the Global Compact, and that is a voluntary governance organization through which firms can agree to a set of principles of how they behave when it comes to the environment, social issues, and also like labor rights and human rights type issues. And so, reasonable people can agree to disagree over how much we want multinational firms to be involved in policymaking, because they're not democratic institutions by any means, but they are there and they are working with these global institutions that are comprised of states to try to deal with some of the most pressing and important problems that the global community faces, especially climate change. So in a week or two, or actually in a few weeks in New York, the UN General Assembly will be meeting, and you'll see a lot of multinational firms involved in discussions kind of around the UN General Assembly in different capacities throughout that week. And that reflects how important global firms are to the international system at this juncture.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sarah, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. That's all for this edition of CIBER Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, CIBER, @indiana.edu.